Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere deeply familiar and yet completely unhinged. The American suburb, circa 1962 on a Tuesday night, at a dinner party hosted by someone named Diane or possibly Barbara, who has been stress cleaning since 7 in the morning. We're talking about the ridiculous, baffling and somehow deeply judgmental world of etiquette at the 1960s suburban dinner party. Not a banquet, not a gala. Just 12 adults in a split-level ranch home in Ohio, eating jello mold and silently evaluating each other's casserole dishes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a huge, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and you have excellent instincts. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. The channel is also on Spotify now, links in the description if you'd rather. Have this playing while you do absolutely nothing productive. Now go ahead and dim those lights, put a fan on, and get yourself completely horizontal. Let's take a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to throw a dinner party in 1962? Did you need a specific fork for every course, or were you simply assumed to already know? What happened if you arrived 5 minutes early? What happened if you arrived 5 minutes late? Was there a correct way to compliment the pot roast that wouldn't accidentally imply the previous pot roast was inferior? Could a woman speak about politics? Could a man not speak about politics? Was there a rule about where to put your hands when you weren't actively eating? There were rules about everything. There were rules about the rules. And nobody handed you a pamphlet. You were just supposed to know, and if you didn't, well, Diane noticed, and Diane always told Carol, congratulations, you've just been invited to a dinner party in the suburbs of America. The year is 1963. You have 48 hours to figure out what to bring, what to wear, what to say, what not to say, and how to survive 4 hours at a table where the centerpiece cost more than your grocery budget and the silence is somehow louder than the conversation. Good luck. The invitation is sitting on your kitchen counter and it has already ruined your week. It's a small cream-coloured card with very neat handwriting and the words, dinner, Saturday the 14th, 7 o'clock printed with a confidence that implies everything else is your problem to figure out. In 1960s suburban America, receiving a dinner party invitation wasn't just a social pleasure, it was a logistical event horizon. Immediately, questions multiplied. Was it formal or informal? Was informal actually formal with a smaller fork? Should you call to confirm, or was calling to confirm considered anxious? Should you not call and risk being thought indifferent? You folded the card, unfolded it, folded it again, and tried to remember whether you'd served Barbara chicken or beef last spring, because God forbid you repeat a protein. The invitation told you almost nothing and expected you to know everything. Dinner could mean 6 people or 16. 7 o'clock could mean cocktails at 7 with dinner at 8. Or it could mean you were expected at the table at 7 sharp, which, if you arrived at 7 sharp, was itself a minor violation. The card didn't specify attire because attire was understood, except it wasn't. You spent 20 minutes on the phone with your closest friend trying to decode the social implications of the address. Ridgewood Drive meant the good china. Elmwood Court could go either way. You put the invitation on the refrigerator with a magnet, then moved it to the bulletin board, then back to the counter, because it felt like it needed to be somewhere you could see it at all times. It became a low-grade presence in your week, something you were always in the background aware of the way you're aware of a dentist appointment or an unfinished tax form. You thought about it while doing dishes. You thought about it while driving to the grocery store. You thought about it at 2 in the morning while staring at the ceiling, running a quiet inventory of everything in your wardrobe. Here's the thing about 1960s dinner party invitation. It wasn't just an invitation to eat food in someone's home. It was an invitation to be evaluated. The moment you accepted, you entered a kind of unspoken audition for taste, for manners, for the ability to hold a conversation without saying anything interesting enough to be controversial. You were being invited to demonstrate that you belonged in that room, at that table, among those people, and you were going to be assessed on criteria that nobody would ever tell you in advance. Modern life has largely freed us from this particular form of social dread. You get a text that says, "Come over Saturday, we're doing pizza," and the most stressful part is remembering to reply before you forget. But in 1963, a dinner party invitation arrived like a small formal summons, and the correct response was not "sounds fun." It was a handwritten note delivered by mail using the good pen, saying you were delighted to accept and looking forward to the evening, written in a tone that suggested this was simply how you communicated, naturally, always, as a person who owned stationery and used it. You accepted, of course. You always accepted. Because declining a dinner party invitation required a reason so bulletproof it could withstand the quiet scrutiny of the neighbourhood, and we just didn't feel like it was not and would never be that reason. The card went back on the counter. Saturday was 11 days away. You had a lot to figure out. The letters stand for the French phrase meaning "please respond," which is a polite way of saying we need a head count and your silence is actively stressing us out. In the 1960s, the RSVP was its own etiquette minefield. You were supposed to respond promptly, not immediately, which would seem desperate, but within a day or two, which showed enthusiasm and respect without veering into eagerness. You replied by phone if you were friendly enough with the hosts, or by written note if the invitation was formal enough to warrant it. A handwritten response to a handwritten invitation was considered very good form. Failing to RSVP at all was the kind of thing that got mentioned at other dinner parties, usually in a tone of quiet horror, as if the non-responder had committed a small but unforgettable act of social violence. The phone call version of an RSVP had its own choreography. You didn't call during the dinner hour, that was between 5:30 and 7, when families were eating, and answering the phone was an interruption rather than a pleasure. You didn't call too early in the morning, which suggested urgency. You called mid-morning or early afternoon, when a woman was likely home and available, which she usually was, because in 1963 most suburban wives were home and available during the day. You asked for her by name if someone else answered. You said you were calling about the dinner on the 14th. You expressed pleasure and accepted gracefully in 2 sentences, without elaborating extensively about why you were free or listing the other things you had had to rearrange in order to attend. What you absolutely did not do was call to accept and then begin negotiating. We'd love to come, though Jim has his back thing on Fridays, so Saturday's better actually, and we can't stay too late because we have the Hendersons' brunch the next morning. No, you accepted. You said thank you. You confirmed the details if there was any ambiguity. You got off the phone before you could accidentally say something complicated. Declining required more finesse. A decline had to come with a reason, and the reason had to be specific enough to be credible, but not so detailed it sounded invented. "We have a prior commitment" was the classic formulation, vague enough to be unanswerable, polite enough to avoid offence. What you didn't say was "we're not free without any further explanation," because that implied you were free for something, just not this. The subtext was audible. People heard it. And then there was the worst-case scenario, accepting and then cancelling. Cancelling within the week before a dinner party was a genuine social injury. The hostess had already counted your chairs. She'd already planned the seating around you. She'd possibly adjusted a recipe to account for your presence or your known preferences, or the thing you'd mentioned once about not caring for mushrooms. Cancelling required either a crisis or something so close to a crisis that it functioned as one. A cold did not qualify. A bad cold could, in certain circumstances, with the right level of evident suffering communicated through the voice. A surgical emergency was frankly a relief. Clean, inarguable, no follow-up questions. The RSVP was at its core a promise, and in the social architecture of the 1960s suburb, a broken promise had a long memory. You couldn't show up empty-handed. That much everyone agreed on. But bringing the right thing was a course in applied diplomacy that nobody taught and everybody judged. Wine was an option, but only if you were careful. Bringing a wine the host was known to prefer was gracious, but bringing a wine that outclassed their cellar was considered showing off, and bringing something cheap was somehow worse than nothing. Flowers were safe in theory, but in practice they created immediate labour. The hostess would need to stop greeting guests, find a vase, fill it with water, and arrange them, all while smiling. Candy was acceptable. Chocolates were elegant. Homemade anything was a gamble that said either I care deeply or I don't trust your cooking, depending on what you made and whether it survived the car ride intact. The hostess gift existed in a slightly paradoxical social position. It was expected, but it was not supposed to be too large or too impressive, because an overly grand gift created a debt that the hostess now owed you, and nobody wanted to start a dinner party already behind on social obligations. The gift was a gesture, not a statement. It said, I appreciate the effort you've made, and I've made a modest effort in return. Anything beyond that scale entered a different register, the register of people trying too hard, which was its own category of social failure in 1960s suburbia. Chocolates were perhaps the safest option. A nice box, Whitman's sampler, or something from an actual confectionery if you lived near one, said elegant but not extravagant, which was exactly the tone you were aiming for. The box was presented at the door, accepted graciously, placed somewhere that was not the table, and opened at a later time that did not involve you watching to see which pieces got taken. You gave the gift, you released the gift, you moved on. Plants were a newer trend and somewhat risky. A potted plant implied a permanence. You were leaving something living in this person's home, something that required care, and if it died, you'd created a small botanical reminder of your visit that sat in the kitchen window for 3 months before anyone had the heart to throw it out. Cut flowers were better, but only if they came pre-arranged in something that didn't need a vase, which was harder to find than you'd think. What about wine? Wine was increasingly acceptable as the decade progressed, and American households became more familiar with the concept of wine as a dinner accompaniment rather than a European affectation. But wine had the specific complication of being something that might be open that evening, which meant it was now implicitly part of the dinner, and if it wasn't open that evening you had to wonder where it had gone and what that meant. Wine also required you to have an opinion about wine, and 1960s suburban America was still largely in the process of forming those opinions, cautiously, one bottle at a time. The simplest rule was this: bring something consumable, bring it in a form that didn't require immediate action, hand it over warmly at the door, and don't mention it again for the rest of the evening. If she served the chocolates with coffee later, you admired them as if you'd never seen them before. Because the gift was never really about the object. It was about demonstrating that you understood how this worked. There was no dress code written on the invitation because the dress code was understood, except it wasn't, because it kept changing, and the rules were different depending on whose house you were going to, what neighbourhood they lived in, what the husband did for a living, and whether or not someone's mother-in-law was expected to attend. In the early 1960s, cocktail-length dresses were standard for women, elegant but not theatrical, modest but not frumpy. Men wore suits, always suits. A sports jacket might be acceptable depending on the host's disposition and how far into the decade you were, but arriving tieless was a statement nobody intended to make. The goal was to look effortful without looking like you tried too hard, which is the most difficult thing a human being can attempt. The dress code operated on a kind of collective telepathy. Women in the same social circle read each other's choices the way you might read a weather report, with attention, with interpretation, and with the occasional whispered remark to your husband as you pulled into the driveway about whether you'd overdressed or underdressed, which could not be confirmed until you were inside and it was too late to do anything about it. The answer, if you'd gotten it wrong, was to carry it off. Looking uncertain about your clothing was worse than having chosen the wrong clothing. Confidence was its own dress code. For women, the specifics mattered considerably. The dress length, the heel height, the jewellery, not too much, not so little as to suggest you hadn't tried. Pearls were almost universally correct. They suggested a kind of quiet, assured femininity that the 1960s dinner party considered ideal. Gloves had been more common in the previous decade and were now becoming optional, though some women still wore them to very formal evenings as a kind of sartorial statement that they were old school in the best possible way. Hair was expected to be done, set, sprayed, arranged into something that suggested you'd had it attended to that afternoon, which many women had. For men, the calculus was simpler, but not simple. A dark suit was safest. A lighter suit was acceptable in summer. The tie was not negotiable in most households, until the decade had progressed enough that certain more relaxed hosts began tacitly communicating through their own dress that the tie could stay in the car. This communication happened non-verbally, which required that you already know your host well enough to read him correctly, which meant that tieless dressing at a dinner party was still mostly available to men who were very confident, very casual, or very friendly with the host, categories that overlapped less than you'd expect. The underlying principle was respect. You dressed for someone else's evening, not for your own comfort. You signalled, through your appearance, that this occasion mattered enough to you, that you'd thought about it, prepared for it, and presented yourself accordingly. In a decade where appearances were still very much understood as a form of communication, what you wore was what you said before you'd said a word, and you wanted the first thing you said to be, roughly, "I know how this works," because the alternative, arriving in something too casual, too bold, too unusual, said something entirely different. It said you hadn't thought about it, or worse, that you had thought about it, and decided the rules didn't apply to you, and the rules always applied. That was rather the point. Arriving on time in 1960s dinner party culture was not in fact arriving on time. Arriving precisely at the stated hour was considered slightly aggressive. It implied the hostess should already be composed and the house already perfect, which she was and it was, but acknowledging that she'd needed every minute until 7 was considered indelicate. The accepted window was between 5 and 15 minutes late. 5 minutes showed courtesy, 15 minutes showed ease, 20 minutes pushed into inconsiderate, 30 minutes required a compelling excuse involving at least one act of God or a traffic situation with witnesses. Arriving early, even 1 minute early, was essentially a home invasion. You might catch Barbara in her slip, or worse, in an apron, and neither of you would ever emotionally recover. The etiquette manuals of the era were fairly specific about this, which tells you how seriously people took it. Emily Post, who remained a significant presence in suburban American households well into the 1960s, had thoughts about arrival. So did Amy Vanderbilt, whose complete book of etiquette sat on enough American bookshelves to constitute a kind of secular scripture. Both of them understood that the gap between the stated start time and the acceptable start time was a form of social grace, a buffer that allowed the host to finish, compose and present without the awkwardness of being caught mid-process by a guest who had taken the invitation too literally. The drive to the dinner party, if you lived nearby, sometimes involved a deliberate detour. You knew you were ready at 6:52, but you also knew that 6:52 was a catastrophe, so you drove around the block, maybe twice. Maybe you parked down the street and waited for the clock on the dashboard to reach 7:04. This was not unusual. This was sensible. Your hosts would never know, and you would arrive with exactly the right energy, warm, unhurried, suggesting that you'd come from something pleasant and were glad to be here, without implying that you'd had nothing better to do than wait in your car outside their house for 3 minutes. What you absolutely could not do was be the last to arrive. Being last meant that the cocktail hour was already in motion, conversations had already formed, and you entered the room as an interruption rather than an arrival. Everyone turned to look. The hostess came to greet you. Introductions were made or remade or half-made, and the whole early rhythm of the evening was briefly disrupted by your entrance. Being last was forgivable if your reason was good. Being last habitually was a reputation. People made accommodating comments about it. "Oh, that's just how they are," in a tone that made clear it was not actually fine. Timing your arrival was, in a broader sense, a form of consideration. You were thinking not about your own convenience, but about the shape of the evening as the host had designed it. You were a piece of a larger arrangement, and the arrangement worked better when all the pieces arrived in the right order. It sounds like a small thing. It sounds almost absurdly small, but in a world built on the accumulation of small correct choices, arrival time was the very first one. And the first impression, as any etiquette manual would solemnly confirm, was the one that lasted longest. The moment you crossed the threshold, you were already being assessed on approximately 11 different criteria, none of which anyone would ever voice aloud. You handed over your coat gracefully, not by shrugging it off and tossing it at the host, but by unbelting it smoothly, sliding it from your shoulders and presenting it in a way that suggested you'd done this 1,000 times in much grander homes. You greeted your host with warmth, but not volume. You complimented the home in a way that was specific enough to seem genuine, but not so specific as to suggest you'd been cataloguing their decorating choices. You accepted the first drink quickly. Hovering over the tray too long suggested indecisiveness, and making a special request suggested you were already being difficult. The foyer of a 1960s suburban home was modest by most measures. A small square of tiled floor, a coat rack or closet, possibly a small table with flowers or a decorative bowl for keys, but it operated as a kind of airlock between the outside world and the social performance of the evening. You crossed it, and the door closed behind you, and you were now in. Whatever you'd left behind, your actual mood, your actual clothes-related regret, the argument you'd had in the car about whether you were too early, all of that, stayed on the other side of the door. Greeting the host correctly was its own small art. You shook hands with the husband, you embraced the wife, or kissed her cheek depending on your familiarity. You made eye contact. You said something warm and specific. "What a lovely evening," or "The house looks beautiful," in a tone that was genuine rather than performed, which is a distinction people could hear even if they couldn't articulate it. Complimenting the smell of the food was acceptable and usually delighted the hostess, because it meant the 6 hours she'd spent cooking were producing an olfactory advertisement that had already begun selling itself. What you didn't do was look around the room while greeting the hosts, because looking around while greeting someone told them that you were already more interested in what was behind them than in them. You didn't mention anything about your journey unless it was brief and amusing. You didn't launch immediately into a story about your week, because the foyer wasn't the venue for that. The living room was the venue for that, and even there you'd want to wait until the group was formed and settled. The foyer was purely for arrivals. You arrived, you greeted, you moved forward. There was a physical grammar to crossing a threshold into someone else's home in this era, a choreography of small gestures that said, "I am a person who belongs in rooms like this." The coat surrendered without ceremony, the handshake firm and brief, the smile present before the door fully opened, held steady through the greeting, carried into the living room where it was released into general warmth and stayed there for the duration of the evening. You weren't performing exactly, or rather you were performing, but the whole point of the performance was that it didn't look like one. You were just effortlessly, graciously, exactly what the occasion required. Before anyone sat down to eat, there was the cocktail hour, which in practice lasted anywhere, from 45 minutes to indefinitely, depending on how long it took everyone to arrive and how much Doris had already had. This was the social gauntlet, a room full of people making conversation about nothing, all while standing at carefully calibrated distances from one another and holding drinks at the correct height. Topics were approved in advance by the invisible committee of suburban propriety. The weather, a recent vacation, local news of a pleasant variety, the children's activities, a film everyone had seen. Topics to avoid included money, illness, divorce, religion, politics, unless it was the kind of politics everyone already agreed on, and anything that had recently appeared in the newspaper under a distressing headline. Small talk is often dismissed as trivial, but in the context of the 1960s dinner party, small talk was load-bearing. It was the structural material that held the first hour of the evening together while everyone found their footing, assessed the room, and located the people they actually wanted to speak to. Done well, it felt effortless. Done badly, it felt like two people slowly running out of sentence in front of witnesses. The trick was to ask questions, genuine, interested questions that generated responses, which generated follow-up questions, which generated the pleasant illusion that a conversation was happening rather than two people politely waiting for someone more interesting to arrive. You had a repertoire. Everyone had a repertoire. A few reliable topics that you could deploy with confidence and that reliably produce conversational momentum. Travel was good, people liked talking about where they'd been or where they were going, and it required no particular vulnerability. Children were excellent. Everyone with children had opinions about their children and was usually just waiting for an opening. Cars were reliable for men, particularly the new models, which gave everyone something to hold a view about, without it mattering too much. You carried these topics like a sensible person carries an umbrella, not expecting to need them, but very glad to have them when the sky darkened. What you avoided beyond the forbidden zones of money and politics was anything that cast a shadow over the evening. A recent illness in the family, a professional difficulty, a piece of neighbourhood gossip that was too fresh or too painful to have become amusing yet. The cocktail hour operated on the principle that everything being discussed was fine. Everyone was fine. The neighbourhood was fine. The country was basically fine. These were the terms of engagement, and you upheld them, not out of dishonesty, but out of a genuine collective desire to create an evening that felt pleasant, which was itself a kind of gift you were giving the hosts and each other. The physical component mattered too. You stood, you moved, you didn't plant yourself in one corner for the full hour. You circulated, which was the social virtue most explicitly valued in the cocktail hour, the ability to move through a room, briefly animate every conversation, and distribute your attention with something resembling fairness. Holding your drink at the right height was genuinely a thing. Too low suggested you'd forgotten it was there. Too high suggested you were using it as a prop, which you were, but the point was not to look like you were. Just slightly below shoulder height, held loosely. You had practiced this more than you would ever admit. Nobody told you where to stand during the cocktail hour, which meant everyone immediately gravitated toward the person they already knew and formed a small, impenetrable cluster near the fireplace, leaving the new couple from across the street stranded near the hi-fi cabinet. The skillful guests circulated, drifted from group to group with the smooth inevitability of a leaf on a slow-moving current, pausing just long enough to contribute something pleasant before gliding on. Hosts watched for the wallflowers and the conversation monopolist with equal anxiety. The monopolist was the man who had opinions about the new highway and intended to share all of them, in order, before anyone had finished their first drink. The wallflower was whoever had been seated next to the monopolist last time, and had not yet fully recovered. The living room arrangement at a cocktail party or pre-dinner gathering told you everything about the social dynamics of the group if you knew how to read it. The furniture was usually arranged to facilitate conversation, sofas facing each other across a coffee table, armchairs angled into the group, but people rarely used the furniture during the cocktail hour. They stood because standing allowed mobility, and mobility was the whole social point. Sitting down too early was the conversational equivalent of dropping anchor. You were done. You'd chosen your spot and your companions, and everyone who walked past you now knew it. The host and hostess were responsible for the circulation of the room in a very literal sense. It was their job to notice when a cluster had closed in on itself too completely, when the new couple had been standing slightly too far from the main group for slightly too long, when the man with the highway opinions had pinned someone to the mantelpiece and showed no signs of releasing them. The host moved through the room, making introductions, building bridges, redistributing conversational energy, the way a good teacher redistributes attention in a classroom, subtly, with apparent naturalness, as if it were happening on its own. Introductions were their own micro-event. You introduce people with the right amount of context, enough to give them something to build a conversation on, not so much that it felt like a dossier. This is Jim Henderson. He's just moved in on Elmwood. He and Carol have 3 kids about your age, gave people the raw material. This is Jim. He's an engineer at Consolidated. His youngest just made the junior baseball team. And he and Carol bought the Williams place on Elmwood, which they're renovating actually. Starting with the kitchen was a briefing document, and left the two of them with nothing to discover about each other. The living room during the cocktail hour was a kind of social ecosystem, and every guest was both participant and observer. You were performing small talk while quietly noticing who was talking to whom, who seemed at ease, who seemed like they needed a rescue. You arrived at the table already knowing something about everyone, which was exactly the point. In the 1960s, cocktails weren't just refreshments, they were personal statements delivered in glassware. A martini said you were serious and probably read magazines. A Manhattan said you were the kind of person who had strong opinions about whiskey and would express them. A highball was practical and unfussy. Wine before dinner was European in a way that Suburban Ohio hadn't fully decided about yet. Asking for something non-alcoholic required a reason. Pregnancy, medication, or religion were all acceptable. But simply not wanting one raised questions nobody was comfortable asking. The host mixed the drinks himself, or a husband did it while the wife attended to whatever was happening in the kitchen that had been creating quiet, alarming smells since 4 in the afternoon. The cocktail itself occupied a specific cultural position in the early 1960s that it hasn't occupied since. It was simultaneously a daily ritual and a social signal, a small, elegant act that belonged to a particular vision of adult American life that Mad Men would later make extremely romantic and extremely problematic in roughly equal measure. You drank because the hour warranted it, because your host had prepared it, because the evening was the kind of occasion that called for something in a glass that wasn't water. The specific drink you chose within that framework communicated things about your tastes, your sophistication, and your relationship to the culture of the moment. The martini was the prestige drink, and it knew it. Clear, cold, demanding, served in a glass that could be tipped over by a medium-sized sneeze. The martini required you to hold it correctly, sip it slowly, and convey the impression that this was how you unwound, every evening naturally, in a manner that suggested considerable inner elegance. The Gibson, the whiskey sour, the old-fashioned, these all had their adherents and their associations. Bourbon was American and dependable. Scotch was sophisticated with slight British overtones. Gin was the backbone of the martini and therefore respectable, though gin consumed in a context where everyone else was having bourbon could read as a mild form of self-distinction. The hostess had usually prepared something in advance, a pitcher of something pre-mixed, often a variation on a punch if the gathering was larger. or a well-stocked bar cart if the hosts were the kind of people who kept a well-stocked bar cart, which was increasingly common as the decade progressed and bar carts became a feature of mid-century homes that said, "We enjoy ourselves." You accepted whatever was offered first with visible pleasure. You didn't ask if there was something different. You didn't request a specific brand. You received your drink, held it at the correct height, and became a person at a cocktail party, which was a role you'd been preparing for since the invitation arrived and intended to play very well indeed. The kitchen in a 1960s dinner party home was a controlled disaster, and everyone in the house knew it except the guests in the living room, who were meant to believe that dinner arrived fully formed from some elegant, effortless process that required no sweating. The hostess had been cooking since that morning. The jello mould had been refrigerated since yesterday. The roast had been calculated, to the minute, and the minute was now 6:58, and it was not cooperating. Offering to help was a delicate gesture, too enthusiastic and you implied she needed it, too half-hearted and you'd get assigned a task anyway. The correct move was a single warm offer, quickly deflected, after which you retreated to the living room, refreshed your drink and pretended you couldn't hear whatever was being said very quietly on the other side of the swinging door. The kitchen was sacred and forbidden in the way that backstage is sacred and forbidden. It was where the magic was manufactured, and letting the audience behind the curtain broke the agreement that everyone was maintaining at significant mutual effort. A dinner party operated on a specific collective fiction, that this had all come together naturally, that the hostess was simply the kind of person whose home produced these results, that the food had not required 6 phone calls to the butcher and a 30-minute crisis over the sauce at 4:30 in the afternoon. The kitchen was where that fiction was produced, and it needed to be kept out of view. The etiquette around the kitchen had a specific feminine dimension that was particular to this era. The hostess in 1960s suburban America was expected to produce a dinner party largely on her own, planning the menu, shopping, cooking, setting the table, arranging the flowers, selecting the music on the hi-fi, managing the children, and being composed and welcoming at the door at 7 o'clock. That this was extraordinary was not acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging the labour, which would have undermined the whole performance. The goal was for the dinner to appear as though it had materialised through some quality of the home itself, some general ambient graciousness, rather than through the specific concentrated effort of one woman who had not sat down since 2 in the afternoon. This meant that the swinging kitchen door, a feature of many ranch-style homes of the period, was a genuinely load-bearing piece of domestic architecture. It allowed the hostess to move between the kitchen and the dining room, between the reality and the performance, without exposing one to the other. You could hear things through that door if you were standing near it, the particular quality of silence that preceded a stressful moment, the rapid, quiet consultation between husband and wife that suggested something had gone slightly wrong and was being managed. You heard none of it. You were near the hi-fi, engaged in conversation, refreshing your drink, appreciating the floral arrangement, performing the complete opposite of hovering near the kitchen door listening. The one guest who always ended up in the kitchen anyway was the one who'd known the hostess longest. She slipped through the swinging door with a familiarity that suggested she'd been doing it for years because she had, and for a few minutes the hostess could drop the performance and actually be worried about the sauce, which was the greatest gift a friend could give. You were not that guest unless you actually were that guest, in which case you already knew it. At some point the hostess appeared in the living room doorway with the expression of a woman who had achieved something against considerable odds and was ready to be acknowledged for it. Dinner is served, or some warmer, more casual version of that phrase, was the signal that the cocktail hour was officially concluded and the real performance was beginning. The transition to the dining room was its own small etiquette event. You didn't surge forward. You moved at a polite drift, finishing your sentence, setting down your glass, and allowing the host to lead. You did not ask where to sit. There was a seating chart, mental or physical, and the hostess had reasons for it that went back months, sometimes years. You found your place card, or you found your place via implication, and you sat without commentary. The moment dinner is served was announced. The energy of the room changed in a specific way, a collective loosening of the cocktail hour posture, a small communal exhale that said, "Good, something is happening, we are moving to the next phase." The cocktail hour was enjoyable but also effortful. It required standing, circulating, maintaining the performance of ease while actually working quite hard at it. The dining room meant chairs. It meant a fixed position. It meant the conversation would be structured by proximity rather than by personal navigation, which was, for many people, an enormous relief. You knew who was on your left and who was on your right, and those were your people for the next hour and a half. You could stop performing and start actually talking, which was its own skill, but at least it had a fixed address. Setting down your cocktail glass was its own micro-gesture. You looked for a coaster, or a side table, or handed the glass to whoever was collecting them near the bar cart. You did not carry your cocktail to the dinner table, unless the host explicitly indicated that was welcome, because the cocktail glass was an artifact of the previous hour, and bringing it to the table confused the timeline. Dinner had its own glasses, water, wine, and they were already set and waiting, and arriving at the table with a martini glass in hand said, "I'm not quite ready to leave that behind," which was a small social transparency nobody needed to witness. The walk from the living room to the dining room was brief, but not without its own grammar. Couples who had arrived together did not necessarily walk in together. The separation had already happened during the cocktail hour, and you continued toward your assigned seat as an individual rather than as a unit. This was by design. The whole architecture of the dinner party was arranged to ensure that you spent the evening engaged with the broader group rather than retreating into the comfortable bubble of whoever you'd driven over with. The dinner table was a social instrument, and it worked best when everyone at it was genuinely present and genuinely engaged, not recounting something to their spouse that the spouse had already heard on the way over. You found your place, and you stood behind your chair until the hostess was seated, or until the host indicated that everyone should sit depending on the formality of the household. Pulling out a chair for a woman seated beside you was correct and expected. Sitting down before the women were seated was the kind of thing that got a man described, in a very specific flat tone, as not particularly well brought up. It was a small thing. Everything was a small thing. That was entirely the point. The dinner party seating chart was one of the most quietly political documents in the 1960s suburban household. Every placement was deliberate, calibrated, and occasionally a form of extremely polite revenge. Couples were separated always because keeping husbands and wives together was considered antisocial, an implication that they couldn't manage a conversation with anyone else. The most interesting guest sat next to the host. The most potentially difficult guest sat next to whoever was best at managing them. The new couple was distributed strategically, one per side of the table, like diplomatic envoys, and if Barbara had seated you next to Richard again after what happened at the Hendersons in March, that was not an accident. Barbara remembered everything. The seating chart was constructed days in advance, sometimes with actual diagrams, small rectangles of paper representing the table, smaller rectangles with names written on them, shuffled and rearranged on the kitchen counter like a very civilized puzzle with significant personal stakes. The hostess considered compatibility, conversational range, professional common ground, and the various human frictions that existed within the group and needed to be either managed or avoided. Two people who'd been involved in a neighbourhood dispute over a fence line were not seated adjacent. Two people who had previously proven they could talk for 3 hours straight about absolutely nothing were seated together as a gift to everyone around them. Place cards were used for larger gatherings, small folded cards with names written in neat cursive, positioned above the bread plate, doing the crucial work of telling everyone where to go without requiring the hostess to personally conduct 11 adults to their chairs, like an extremely well-dressed air traffic controller. Place cards also eliminated the terrible moment of guests hovering uncertainly near the table, trying to read the room, glancing at each other with the specific anxiety of people who don't know whether to sit or wait for instruction. The place card said, "Here, this is where you belong this evening. Sit down. Relax. Someone has thought about this more carefully than, you know." The no couples rule was the one that caused the most quiet consternation among guests who would never say so out loud. You arrived together, you had been together all week, and now you were being deliberately separated and expected to have stimulating conversations with people who were not your spouse, which required a degree of social independence that not everyone had maintained equally well over the course of a marriage. Some couples thrived at this, genuinely enjoyed the forced expansion, came home afterward comparing notes about what they'd each learned. Others sat at opposite ends of the table, making occasional eye contact across the centerpiece with the silent mutual communication of two people who have developed their own language and find everyone else's considerably less efficient. The seating chart was, at its most generous reading, an act of care, a hostess arranging her guests like flowers in a vase, with attention to colour and height and which ones would look best beside which others. At its least generous reading, it was a 1960s woman exercising one of the very few domains of genuine authority available to her, with tremendous skill and very little acknowledgement. Both readings were correct. The dining table centerpiece in a 1960s dinner party home was the physical manifestation of the hostess's taste, ambition, and the approximate number of hours she'd spent at the florist. Fresh flowers were ideal, low enough to see over, never so tall as to require guests to speak around them as if conducting conversations around a hedge. Candles were expected and provided the soft, forgiving light that made everyone look better and the food look edible. The centerpiece was not to be moved, adjusted, rearranged, or commented upon except favourably. Remarking that the flowers were a bit much was something you might think privately and take to your grave. The one unforgivable action was reaching across the centerpiece for something. This suggested the bread wasn't close enough to you, which was now somehow everyone's problem. Flower selection for a centerpiece was not casual. It was a decision that required knowledge of what was currently in season, what colours complemented the dining room's existing palette, and what arrangement style communicated the right level of formality without tipping into ostentation. Low, loose arrangements of garden flowers suggested warmth and ease. Tight, formal arrangements of roses or carnations suggested this was a significant occasion, and you should conduct yourself accordingly. Flowers from one's own garden, if presented correctly, suggested a certain charming abundance, a home so well tended that beauty simply overflowed from it into the dining room. Flowers from the grocery store florist required better vase placement. The candles were non-negotiable. In the early 1960s, electric lighting was everywhere and used freely in every other room of the house, but the dining room at a dinner party was still candlelit, because candlelight did something to the quality of an evening that overhead fixtures simply could not replicate. It slowed things down. It made faces warmer and voices quieter, and the whole enterprise feel more considered. It transformed a meal into an occasion, which was exactly what was required. The candles were lit before guests were seated and were not, under any circumstances, blown out during the meal, even if one of them began a slow, slightly menacing lean toward the nearest flower arrangement. The height rule for centerpieces was both practical and socially significant. Too tall, and guests on opposite sides of the table lost visual contact with each other, which meant conversations had to travel farther, which meant they arrived slightly distorted, which meant the table fragmented into two separate conversations that never quite unified into one. A good centerpiece sat at a height that allowed everyone to see everyone, else clearly that allowed the table to function as a single conversational unit, rather than two teams separated by flora. The hostess who understood this had thought about her centerpiece not as decoration, but as architecture. She was, in a sense, designing the conversation. You admired it. You said something genuine and specific. What beautiful roses, or these colours are just lovely, in the first minute after sitting down, before the first course arrived, while the compliment still felt spontaneous. Then you left it alone and never mentioned it again. It had done its job. So had you. If you've ever looked at a formally set dinner table and felt a small, private panic about which fork was for what, congratulations! So did everyone at the dinner party, they just hid it better. The 1960s formal table setting was a topographical landscape of silverware, crystal, and china that communicated the host's social aspirations in 3 square feet of linen. Forks to the left, knives, and spoons to the right, arranged from outside to inside in the order of use, meaning you worked your way inward through the courses, which was fine as long as you knew how many courses there were going to be, which nobody told you in advance. The bread plate was on the left, the water glass was upper right. Using your neighbour's bread plate was a mistake with social consequences that outlasted the bread. The formal place setting in its full 1960s expression was a kind of material argument that this household understood the rules and had the equipment to prove it. The good china, not the everyday dishes, not the ones used for Tuesday night dinner with the children, but the actual good china that lived in the buffet cabinet and came out perhaps 6 times a year, appeared at dinner parties as a declaration of occasion. Bone china, often with a delicate pattern at the rim, white or cream, with a rim of gold or platinum that caught the candlelight and said quietly, "This matters." You used it carefully and complimented it if asked, though complimenting the china uninvited was considered slightly too observant, as if you'd been examining the household's inventory. The silverware itself, often actual silver or silver plate, polished specifically for this evening, was arranged with a precision that communicated fluency in a language that not everyone spoke, but everyone was expected to pretend to. The salad fork, slightly smaller, sat outermost on the left if salad was being served as a first course, which in the 1960s it sometimes was, in the American style, before the main course rather than after. Then the dinner fork, larger, closer to the plate. On the right, from outside in, the salad knife if applicable, the dinner knife, and the soup spoon if soup was coming. The dessert utensils sometimes sat above the plate horizontally, a small spoon and fork arranged like a tiny formal greeting, letting you know dessert was coming and had already been considered. The water glass, and the wine glass, if wine was being served, which was increasingly the case as the decade progressed, sat to the upper right of the plate in a configuration that you navigated by memory and context. You did not pick up the wrong glass. Or rather, you did occasionally because the glasses were close together and the lighting was candlelit, and you had been holding a slightly different glass for the past hour. When this happened, you handled it with composure. You set it down. You found yours. You continued. Nobody commented. Commenting would have been worse than the mistake. The linen napkin, placed either to the left of the forks or folded architecturally on the plate itself, was placed in the lap upon sitting, not tucked into the collar, not left on the table, not forgotten entirely until the soup arrived and you looked down in mild alarm. It stayed in the lap for the duration of the meal and was placed loosely beside the plate when you rose at the end. The folded napkin on a soiled plate was the quiet signal that dinner was concluded and the evening was beginning its gentle migration toward goodbye. The first course was often soup, which is a food that requires you to perform an act of engineering under social scrutiny. The rule was that soup was consumed from the side of the spoon, not the tip, a distinction that seems minor until you're sitting at Diane's table, acutely aware that 4 people can see your spoon technique. You did not blow on the soup to cool it, because apparently this was considered uncouth, which means the expected alternative was to sit quietly with a spoon full of scalding liquid and wait for physics to help you. You did not tip the bowl toward yourself to get the last of it. You tipped it away from yourself, which felt counterintuitive but was correct, and you let the remaining tablespoon of bisque rest at the far rim like a small abandoned lake while you pretended to be satisfied. Soup was served in those flat, shallow bowls that look elegant and hold approximately 1.5 cups of liquid, which was exactly the right amount, enough to constitute a course, not so much as to fill you before the main event. The soup in a 1960s dinner party was often something that could be prepared the day before and reheated with confidence. A cream of tomato, a vichyssoise served cold in summer, a clear consommé with a few careful additions that demonstrated culinary intention. The soup was not the main attraction. The soup was the opening act, and it was expected to be good without being so extraordinary that it upstaged the roast. Eating the soup correctly required a specific combination of physical restraint and social nonchalance that was more difficult than it appeared. The side of the spoon rule was genuine and genuinely monitored by anyone at the table who had been brought up by the sort of parent who considered table manners a moral category. The direction of the spoon, stroke, away from you, pushing the soup toward the far edge of the bowl, then lifting to the mouth, was designed to prevent dripping, because a drip from the tip of a spoon held at the wrong angle was a small catastrophe of an entirely public nature. You were wearing your good clothes, the tablecloth was linen, the steaks were clear. You also could not eat too fast or too slowly. Too fast suggested either hunger you hadn't admitted to, or a desire to be done with this particular course, both of which were impolite in different directions. Too slowly suggested you were dissatisfied, or that you were so engrossed in conversation that you kept forgetting your soup was there, which was slightly more forgivable but still visually awkward as your bowl sat cooling while everyone else's was removed. The ideal pace was synchronized with the table, you observed, peripherally, how far along the people around you were, and you calibrated accordingly. You were eating together. The word together had a literal meaning in this context. When the soup was finished, or finished enough, the spoon was placed on the service plate beneath the bowl, not left in the bowl itself, because a spoon left standing in a soup bowl was liable to tip and clatter and announce itself to the entire table in a way that nobody wanted. You placed it on the plate, you sat back very slightly, you resumed your conversation, and you waited for the bowls to be collected with the particular patience of someone who had been through this before and knew exactly what came next. Bread at a dinner party was not simply bread. It was an opportunity to demonstrate whether you'd been raised correctly or had somehow slipped through civilization's quality control. You did not take a roll and butter the whole thing. You broke off a piece, one small manageable piece, buttered that piece over your bread plate, and ate it before proceeding to the next piece. This process was meant to be slow, deliberate, and invisible. You didn't butter enthusiastically. You did not take the last roll if there was any chance someone else might want it. You did not ask for more butter in a tone that suggested the current amount was insufficient, and you did not, under any circumstances, use your dinner knife to butter your bread, because that was what the butter knife was for, and the butter knife was right there, and there was simply no excuse. The bread basket appeared on the table with the first course, or slightly before it, positioned close enough to be accessible without requiring anyone to reach uncomfortably. It was usually rolls, sometimes sliced bread, occasionally something more ambitious like a dinner bread with herbs if the hostess had been feeling confident that afternoon. The bread was warm, or had been warm recently, which was itself a small act of consideration, Bread served at room temperature said I put it out earlier, while warm bread said I thought about you arriving at this table. These are the distinctions that people in 1960s suburban America genuinely noticed and genuinely appreciated without ever saying so out loud. The piece-by-piece buttering rule descended from a fairly old tradition of table manners, rooted in the practical observation that buttering an entire roll in one gesture and biting directly into it produced a certain visual impression that fine dining establishments preferred to avoid. The bite-sized piece, buttered individually, eaten cleanly. This was bread consumption as a controlled and courteous act. It was also genuinely more elegant in the way that many etiquette rules become elegant once you understand the physical reasoning behind them. You were less likely to drop crumbs, less likely to smear butter somewhere unfortunate, and less likely to consume your entire bread portion in 30 seconds and then sit staring at an empty plate for the next 2 courses. The butter itself was served in a small dish with a butter knife resting. Alongside it, a dedicated implement whose sole purpose was to transfer butter from the communal dish to your bread plate, from which you would then use that same butter knife to butter your individual piece. The knife moved from dish to plate. It did not then move to your mouth. It didn't migrate to the dinner knife position. It stayed on the bread plate slightly diagonal, exactly as it had been when you set it down after the first use. This sounds like a lot of attention to pay to a knife. It was. That was the whole thing about 1960s dinner party etiquette. It was all a lot of attention paid to things that sounded small until you were sitting at the table and you suddenly needed to know. Taking the last roll from the basket required a social calculation. Was anyone else looking at it? Had anyone else reached for it and pulled back? Was it the kind of gathering where taking the last roll would be noticed, or the kind where the basket would simply be refilled without remark? If you were uncertain, you left it. You left it, and you didn't look at it again, and you were quietly glad when it was removed with the rest of the first course things, because at least now it was no longer your responsibility. Dinner party conversation in 1960s. Suburbia operated according to a set of unwritten laws that everyone enforced and nobody acknowledged. You spoke to the person on your left for a while, then pivoted to the person on your right, an informal rotation that prevented anyone from being ignored and everyone from being cornered. You contributed but did not dominate. You asked questions and appeared interested in the answers, even if the answer was a 20-minute account of Gerald's new riding mower. You did not bring up anything upsetting before the main course, and ideally not after it either. You laughed at the right moments, expressed the correct amount of mild surprise at anecdotes, and refrained from correcting anyone's facts unless the error was truly egregious, and you could do it in a tone that sounded like helpfulness rather than superiority. The left-right rotation was an informal but widely understood convention, the kind of thing that nobody had written down in a rulebook for your particular suburban neighbourhood, but that everyone seemed to know anyway, having absorbed it through years of dinner parties and the accumulated social instruction of parents who had attended dinner parties before them. You worked one side through the soup and salad, and somewhere during the main course you pivoted naturally, not abruptly, not mid-sentence, but at a conversational seam to the person on your other side. This ensured that by the end of the evening you were genuinely engaged with both your immediate neighbours, rather than giving all your attention to whoever was more interesting, and leaving the other to make conversation with their bread plate. The quality of conversation that was most prized at these tables was a specific kind of engaged pleasantness, substantive enough to feel like a genuine exchange, light enough to remain comfortable across multiple courses. Wit was appreciated, comedy was welcome, genuine laughter was perhaps the most valuable thing a guest could produce, because laughter released tension and signalled that the evening was going well and that everyone was at ease. A guest who made people laugh genuinely, not performatively, was a guest who got invited back. A guest who was trying to make people laugh, who was visibly working at it, produced a different effect entirely. Listening was as important as speaking, and considerably rarer. The person who listened well, who maintained eye contact, who asked follow-up questions that demonstrated they had actually heard what was said, who remembered something you'd mentioned at a previous gathering and referenced it now. This person was considered a wonderful conversationalist, even if they barely talked at all, because most people at dinner parties, despite the collective fiction that conversation was a mutual exchange, were primarily waiting for their own turn to speak. The person who genuinely wasn't was noticeable, memorable, and almost unfairly well liked as a result. You never corrected the food. You never corrected the host. You never introduced a subject that required someone to choose a side, unless you were certain which side everyone was already on, and were simply providing the opportunity to express it. You kept the conversation moving like water, around obstacles through silences, finding the natural channels and following them, carrying everyone forward through the courses toward the moment when the dessert plates were cleared and the evening began to breathe out. A woman at a 1960s dinner party was expected to be charming, engaged, pleasant, and present, while also not taking up too much conversational space on topics considered to belong by some invisible decree to the men at the table. She could discuss children, homes, recipes, fashion, the social calendar, and television with full authority. She could admire and encourage. She could ask excellent questions. She could redirect a flagging conversation with the grace of a flight attendant managing mild turbulence. What she was not expected to do, and what would produce a particular quality of silence if she did, was launch into an extended opinion about federal policy, foreign affairs, the economy, or anything that had appeared on the front page that morning. That wasn't hostility exactly. It was more like the conversational equivalent of a gentle fence. The fence wasn't always obvious. Nobody said that's not a subject for you. Nobody needed to. The social temperature of the table communicated it. A slight shift in attention. A polite redirect. A husband's hand briefly near his wife's arm, in a gesture that read as affectionate but functioned as a gentle pressure. Women who had opinions on political or economic matters expressed them at other times, in other contexts, or increasingly as the decade progressed, began to notice that the fence existed and to find it considerably less acceptable than they'd previously been conditioned to believe. But at the 1960s dinner party, in its most conventional form, the conversational geography was still largely gendered, and most women navigated it not because they lacked opinions, but because the social cost of expressing them publicly was real and well understood. The subjects that belonged to women at the dinner table were not trivial, even if they were treated as such. Raising children in the 1960s was a complex, demanding, and constantly shifting enterprise, and the women who discussed it at dinner parties were often exchanging genuinely useful information and support. Home management was a full-time occupation for most suburban wives of this era, and the conversations about it, about decorating, about household organization, about the new appliances that were transforming domestic life, were conversations about the actual substance of their daily existence. Fashion and social planning were not frivolous. They were the vocabulary of a world in which a woman's appearance and social competence were among her primary professional tools. What made the arrangement uncomfortable, even at the time, was the asymmetry. A man who discussed his professional opinions at length was being interesting. A woman who did the same was being a lot. A man who redirected conversation was leading it. A woman who did the same was being managing. The same behavior, filtered through gender, produced different assessments, and everyone at the table knew it, even the people who would have insisted they didn't notice. It was the water they all swam in, that particular decade, in those particular homes, on those particular Saturday evenings. Some of them were already starting to notice the temperature. Men at the dinner table were expected to hold forth, which they generally did with enthusiasm and without requiring much encouragement. The subjects were predictable: business, sports, the new car, the state of the country, the cost of things, and whoever was currently in charge of things and doing it wrong. A man with strong opinions was considered interesting. A man with too many strong opinions delivered in too loud a voice was considered a lot, but this was said behind his back and never to his face. The expectation that men would naturally take the conversational lead at the table was so embedded that it wasn't recognized as an expectation. It was simply how dinner parties worked, the same way chairs worked and gravity worked. Nobody questioned it because questioning it wasn't on the approved list of dinner conversation topics. The business conversation was perhaps the most reliable of all the male conversational staples. Men talked about work at dinner parties in the 1960s with a freedom and authority that read as confidence, but was also in part a performance of masculine identity. What you did was who you were. How the business was going told people how you were going. A man who spoke about his work with satisfaction and command was projecting something essential about his place in the order of things. He was succeeding. He was managing. He was in control of the part of the world that was his to manage. A man who didn't talk about his work, or who spoke about it with hesitation, was communicating something different, and everyone at the table heard it even if nobody said so. Sports provided the other great reliable current of male dinner conversation, a subject that had built-in stakes, built-in opinions, and built-in room for disagreement that was passionate without being genuinely divisive. You could argue about baseball with the intensity of a formal debate and walk away from it with the friendship entirely intact, which was the specific social function that sports served in these settings. It provided heat without fire. It let men express competitive enthusiasm in a context where competitive enthusiasm was otherwise somewhat managed. The pennant race, the championship game, the player trade that everyone had a view about, these were the safe battlegrounds of male sociability, and they were used extensively and with evident enjoyment. The length of male contributions at the dinner table was, by contemporary standards, remarkable. A man could begin a story at the soup course and still be concluding it somewhere around the main course, with the table listening or appearing to listen, with the women asking questions that kept the narrative moving, with the other men contributing supporting evidence or competing anecdotes. The monologue wasn't considered a monologue. It was considered a man talking, which was what men did at dinner. The conversational inequality was so thoroughly naturalized that pointing it out would have seemed to most people at the table not like an observation but like a complaint. And complaints at dinner parties were, as we've established, not on the approved list either. The main course arrived, and with it the peak of the hostess's anxiety, carefully concealed behind a composed smile and a very even serving technique. In 1960s suburban dinner parties, the main course was often a roast of some kind: beef, pork, occasionally lamb for the more adventurous households, accompanied by vegetables that had been cooked into a state of acceptance, a starch of some variety, and whatever sauce or gravy had been the subject of concern since approximately noon. The host carved, if there was carving to be done, and the carving was its own performance, done at the table or on the sideboard with a good knife and a confidence that suggested this was effortless, even if the roast was fighting back. Complimenting the main course was mandatory, specific, and warm. "This is wonderful" was fine. "What did you do to..." It was better. The main course was the emotional centre of the dinner party in a way that no other course could match. The soup was a warm-up, the salad was a pause, dessert was a reward. But the main course was the thing, the dish the hostess had planned the entire menu around, the item that had determined the wine, the side dishes, the serving vessel, the timing of every other element of the evening. It was what she'd been thinking about since Monday. It was what the whole afternoon had been in service of, and now it was here, on the table, being eaten by people who were simultaneously conducting conversations and managing their silverware, and trying not to drink too much wine before the plate was cleared, and it needed to be magnificent, or at least very, very good. Carving at the table was a masculine performance that many men of the era carried off with varying degrees of competence and uniform levels of visible confidence. The host stood at the head of the table or at the sideboard, carving knife and fork in hand, and he carved. The quality of the carving, the thickness of the slices, the cleanliness of the cut, the amount of effort visibly required, communicated something about the man that everyone present registered and nobody mentioned. A man who carved well, who produced even, beautiful slices with the economical movements of someone who had done this many times, added something to the evening. A man who sawed at the roast with increasing force while the conversation at the table continued at a slightly elevated volume to cover the sound. This also communicated something, and his wife knew it, and she smiled at the guest nearest her in a way that redirected everyone's attention very professionally. The serving itself moved around the table in a specific direction, counterclockwise or clockwise depending on the household, with the host serving guests before himself and the hostess last. You accepted the serving offered. You did not request more, or less unless explicitly invited to do so. You received your plate with a brief word of pleasure and you set it before you and you waited. Waited until everyone was served. Waited until the hostess had her plate. Waited for the signal that eating could begin, which was the hostess lifting her fork, or the host saying something brief and welcoming, or simply the general movement of the table that said, "Now. We eat now. We've arrived at the part we've all been working toward. Enjoy it." You did. In 1963, the concept of a dinner party guest having dietary restrictions was not entirely absent, but it occupied a strange, slightly apologetic corner of social life that nobody had properly mapped yet. Allergies existed, but were often managed through avoidance rather than disclosure, because disclosing one required a conversation that felt like an imposition. Religious dietary laws were a known quantity and generally handled with grace, but simply not eating something because you didn't enjoy it, or because you were watching what you ate, or because you'd read something concerning in a magazine, this required careful navigation. You ate what was served, you moved things around the plate if necessary. You complimented the dish you'd barely touched, and hoped the hostess was too busy managing everything else to notice the untouched aspic sitting at the edge of your china. The cultural assumption underlying the 1960s dinner party was that the host had made decisions and the guests honoured them. The menu was not a negotiation. It was a gift, carefully prepared and presented, and the correct response to a gift was gratitude, not revision. Informing a hostess in advance that you didn't eat red meat, or that you'd recently decided to avoid starches, or that you'd been having some trouble with dairy since last spring. This placed her in the position of redesigning her menu around your preferences, which was an imposition so significant that most people of the era simply chose not to make it. You ate the beef, you ate the potato, you managed the dairy quietly and hoped for the best. The exception was genuine medical necessity, and even that came with its own etiquette. If you had a condition that required dietary management, diabetes was becoming more commonly discussed, and certain heart conditions had begun generating medical dietary advice that filtered into everyday life. You disclosed it quietly, in advance, in a private phone call, framed as information rather than instruction. I just wanted you to know, in case it helps with planning was the construction. Not I can't eat this, but I wanted you to be aware. The distinction was enormous. One asked for accommodation, the other simply informed and left the decision to the hostess, who was then free to adjust or not as she saw fit. Most hostesses adjusted. Nobody talked about it at the table. The food allergy as a serious medical category was less culturally visible in the early 1960s than it would become in subsequent decades. Peanut allergies existed but were not yet understood as the potentially life-threatening conditions that later research would establish. Shellfish sensitivities were known but rarely discussed in advance. You simply avoided the shrimp cocktail and moved on. The idea that a guest might need to know the complete ingredient list of every dish before eating it would have seemed to the average 1960s hostess not just unusual but faintly absurd. Food was food. You ate it or you didn't, and if you didn't, you did so quietly and with the expression of someone who was simply not very hungry rather than someone who was making a point. What this produced in practice was a significant amount of quiet suffering at dinner tables across suburban America. People ate things they disliked or that disagreed with them because the social cost of not eating them was greater than the physical cost of eating them. They praised dishes. They found difficult and requested recipes for things they would never make. They moved food around their plates with the practiced technique of people who'd been doing this since childhood and had developed it into an art form. It was, in its way, a form of extraordinary social consideration, the willingness to absorb personal discomfort rather than create a moment of awkwardness for someone who had worked since Tuesday to produce this meal. Whether it was admirable or simply unnecessary depended entirely on which decade you were standing in. Nothing says 1960s dinner party quite like a moulded gelatin dish, quivering gently on its serving plate, containing within its translucent body a combination of fruit, vegetables, cream cheese, nuts, and the unshakable conviction that this was elegant. The jello mould was at the absolute height of its cultural authority in the early 1960s, appearing in women's magazines with full-page photographs and names like Perfection Salad and Garden Crown Aspic that suggested they had been developed in a laboratory by people who had never experienced hunger. You accepted a portion when it was offered. You described it as interesting, lovely, or refreshing, depending on what was inside it. You did not ask what was inside it if you were not prepared for the answer, which might be shrimp. The jello mould had arrived at its cultural peak through a combination of mid-century food industry marketing, post-war enthusiasm for processed and convenience foods, and a genuine aesthetic sensibility that found something appealing in food that had been transformed from its natural state into something architectural. General Foods had been promoting gelatin recipes since the 1920s, and by the 50s and 60s their test kitchens were producing recipes of escalating ambition. Dishes that combined sweetened gelatin with savoury ingredients, that suspended vegetables in fruit-flavoured jello, that layered cream cheese and lime gelatin in a way that suggested someone had made a very confident set of decisions and committed to them fully. The results were striking. Not always in the way that was intended, but striking. The appeal was partly visual and partly practical. A jello mould could be made the day before, indeed needed to be, to set properly, which was enormously useful to a hostess managing a dinner party timeline. It arrived at the table already formed, already complete, requiring only unmoulding and garnishing, and it held its shape on the serving plate with a kind of glossy, jewel-like confidence that fresh food could rarely match. It was, in the language of the 1960s hostess, make ahead, which was a quality that ranked somewhere just below divine intervention in terms of practical value. The mould sat in the refrigerator overnight, doing its work quietly while the hostess attended to other crises. The varieties were extraordinary in their range. Sweet moulds combined, fruit gelatin with canned fruit, cream cheese, or whipped topping. Savoury moulds combined unflavoured gelatin with tomato juice, chopped vegetables, mayonnaise, or, in the more adventurous households, canned tuna or shrimp suspended in a cucumber-lime base. These were served as salads or as side dishes, presented on a bed of lettuce, garnished with a small amount of something green, and placed on the table with the quiet authority of someone who had been making this recipe for years and considered it among their better work. The correct response was admiration. The internal response was occasionally different. You ate it anyway. You had the brief, vivid experience of sweetened gelatin yielding under your fork to reveal a slice of olive. And you said it was wonderful. There is a specific social courage required to eat a savoury jello mould graciously and say something genuine about it afterward. It is not the largest form of courage the 1960s required of people, but it was practiced regularly and at considerable frequency, and it deserves acknowledgement. The mould quivered on the plate like something that wasn't entirely sure it had made the right decision, and everyone at the table pretended with great conviction that this was exactly what they'd hoped the salad course would be. America in the 1960s contained multitudes. Some of those multitudes were suspended in lime gelatin. You ate your portion. You moved on. You never spoke of it. Wine with dinner in the 1960s was becoming more common in suburban homes as the decade progressed, though the wine itself was not always a source of confidence for the host, who may have purchased it based on price, label, or the recommendation of a man at the liquor store named Dave. The mechanics of wine at the dinner table had their own rules. You didn't pour your own. You waited for the host to notice your glass was empty and attend to it, and you allowed your glass to be refilled without placing your hand over it in a dramatic gesture of refusal. If you genuinely didn't want more, a quiet, "I'm fine, thank you" delivered to the glass rather than the host was considered graceful. Drinking too much at a dinner party was a social catastrophe that would be discussed in some form for the rest of the year, and possibly referenced obliquely at the following year's Christmas card exchange. American wine culture in the early 1960s was still largely in formation. France was the obvious reference point. French wine carried associations of sophistication, continentalism, and the kind of worldly ease that suburban Americans were increasingly interested in projecting. But French wine was expensive and required knowledge that not everyone had yet acquired, so hosts often defaulted to domestic wines, which were improving but not yet taken entirely seriously, or to whatever the liquor store had recommended with enough conviction to justify the purchase. The label mattered, because the label was visible, and a wine served with confidence from a bottle with a serious-looking label communicated something different from the same wine poured from a bottle that looked like it had been designed for a supermarket promotion. The host poured. That was the rule, and it was consistent and clear. A bottle of wine at a dinner table was the host's instrument. He controlled its distribution, its timing, its rate of replenishment, and he did so with attention to the table as a whole rather than to any individual guest's preferences. A good host noticed when glasses were low and attended to them before they were empty, because an empty glass sitting unremarked on the table was a small failure of hospitality, a gap in the evening's care. He moved around the table or poured from his seat with a cloth napkin folded over the bottle to catch drips, and he did this with the particular ease of someone who did it regularly, or who was successfully performing that ease, which in practice amounted to the same thing. The question of how much to drink was navigated with great individual variation and considerable social consequence. 1 glass was cautious but respectable. 2 was the comfortable middle. You were participating, you were relaxed, you were present. 3 entered territory that required monitoring, both self-monitoring and the quiet peripheral monitoring of the people closest to you, who were tracking the same number and doing the same arithmetic. Beyond 3, the evening began to accumulate risk. Not dramatic risk. Nobody at a 1960s dinner party expected the evening to end badly, and it usually didn't. But the risk of saying something too direct, laughing too loudly, telling a story that ran longer than its material justified, or expressing an opinion with a warmth and conviction that hadn't been there 2 glasses earlier. These were the small social accidents that people remembered, that got folded into the way they talked about each other. Afterward, that became the anecdote that started. Do you remember when Gerald had a bit too much at the Millers and said the thing about the Petersons? Nobody wanted to be that anecdote. Most people managed not to be. Most people. Children in a 1960s household might make a brief theatrical appearance at the start of a dinner party, presented to the guests in their pyjamas for a moment of communal admiration, before being guided firmly back upstairs by whoever had drawn the short straw that evening. This appearance was carefully choreographed. The children said hello, were complimented on their appearance or comportment, said something either charming or mortifying, and were then removed before they could say anything else. They ate earlier, separately, and ideally had been sufficiently distracted by the television to prevent the kind of staircase eavesdropping that resulted in questions the following morning. A child who appeared in the dining room during the main course was a small social emergency. A child who repeated something they'd heard through the floor was a catastrophe that required a follow-up phone call. The presentation of children at the beginning of a dinner party occupied a specific ritual function in the 1960s home. It said, "We have children. They are well behaved and presentable. Here is evidence of our family's proper functioning. We will now remove this evidence so the adults can proceed with their evening." The children participated in this ritual with varying degrees of willingness. Some were natural performers who relished the brief spotlight, who said something delightful, accepted compliments on their pyjamas with a composure suggesting they'd been receiving compliments their whole lives, and departed with the confident energy of someone who had completed a successful engagement. Others stared, others clung, others said something that landed in the living room like a small social grenade and had to be rapidly escorted away before the pin fully dropped. The children's dinner happened earlier, managed by whoever was available, sometimes the mother before she began transforming into the hostess, sometimes a grandmother or neighbour conscripted for the purpose, sometimes an older sibling who resented the assignment and showed it. Children ate in the kitchen or in a separate room, their meal entirely disconnected from the adult dinner in terms of menu, timing and ambition. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes, or something equally practical and child-proof, rather than the roast that was currently performing quietly in the oven for the benefit of people who would appreciate it. The children ate, were bathed, were placed in pyjamas, were briefed on the appearance requirement, and were released into the living room for approximately 4 minutes before being retrieved. The staircase was a particular source of parental anxiety throughout the evening. Children who had been put to bed but not yet achieved. Sleep occupied a zone of dangerous proximity to the adult proceedings below. Sound travelled up staircases with a fidelity that nobody appreciated until it was too late. A child sitting on the 3rd step from the bottom in the dark, listening to the conversation drift up from the dining room, was gathering information that would surface at unpredictable moments. At the breakfast table the next morning, at school the following week, or, most devastatingly, at the very next social gathering where the relevant parties were present. "Mummy, why did you say that Mrs. Henderson's new curtains looked like a motel?" These were the questions that required a very steady voice and a very creative answer, delivered in front of the person whose curtains had been under discussion. You smiled. You found the words. You made a mental note to close the dining room door more firmly next time. Compliments at a 1960s dinner party moved in carefully managed circuits like electricity through a politely insulated wire. You complimented the food, specifically warmly, without hyperbole so exaggerated it became ironic. You complimented the home, something new or notable, a painting, a lamp, a new set of drapes. You complimented the hostess, her appearance, her organisation, the extraordinary effort that had produced this lovely evening, which you acknowledged without making her effort sound effortful, because effort was supposed to be invisible. What you did not do was receive a compliment with a detailed account of how difficult everything had been. The correct response to this roast is wonderful was, "I'm so glad you're enjoying it." Not a 14-minute account of when the butcher had been out of the cut she needed, and she'd had to drive to a different town. The dinner party compliment had a very specific architecture. It needed to be genuine enough to register as sincere, specific enough to demonstrate that you were paying attention, and moderate enough not to tip into flattery, which was a different thing entirely, and carried a slightly unpleasant suggestion that you were working towards something. "These flowers are absolutely beautiful" was a compliment. "I've never seen anything as beautiful as these flowers in my entire life" was flattery, and it made the recipient slightly uncomfortable, and the surrounding guests slightly suspicious of your motives. The correct register was warm, specific, and proportionate. A temperature that said, "I noticed, and I mean it without saying I am performing admiration for strategic purposes." Complimenting a woman's appearance was standard and expected, but required the same calibration. Her dress, her hair, a piece of jewellery, these were safe and welcome. A compliment that was too effusive suggested either insincerity or a degree of attention to her physical appearance that was its own kind of commentary. A compliment delivered in front of her husband was the correct setting, because it allowed him the opportunity to agree, which he was expected to do, which he did with a brief warmth that said, "Yes, I know. I am aware I've done well in this regard." The choreography of the marital compliment circuit at a dinner party was its own small performance, and couples who did it smoothly, who complimented each other's contributions to the evening with the ease of people who genuinely appreciated each other, added something pleasant to the room that everyone felt without identifying its source. Receiving a compliment well was a skill that was actively cultivated in this era and is considerably rarer now. The 1960s understanding of gracious acceptance was that you received a compliment with brief, genuine pleasure. "How kind of you to say so," or "I'm so glad," and then returned attention to the giver or the group rather than dwelling on the compliment or dismissing it entirely. The modern reflex of deflecting every compliment. "Oh, this old thing, it was nothing really. The recipe is so easy, anyone could do it," was considered poor form because it implicitly rejected the judgment of the person who had offered the compliment, which was itself a small discourtesy. You accepted, you thanked, you moved on. Simple, elegant, entirely lost to us now. It happened at every dinner party, at some point, in some form. Someone said the wrong thing, about money, about someone's divorce, about a weight change, about a political opinion that turned out not to be universally shared, and the table went briefly, perfectly silent in a way that the clinking of silverware could not quite fill. The hostess had protocols for this. She changed the subject with the speed and smoothness of a professional illusionist, pivoting to something entirely uncontroversial before the silence could crystallize into something permanent. The person who'd said the wrong thing knew immediately, felt it in the quality of the air, and spent the remainder of the evening being slightly more careful, which produced a different but equally noticeable quality of self-consciousness. Nobody acknowledged what had happened. That was the whole point. The wrong thing took many forms, and not all of them were obviously wrong in advance. Some were wrong in the abstract. You simply did not discuss money at the dinner table. Not what things cost, not what people earned, not what the house had sold for, even if everyone at the table already knew and had discussed it extensively in other settings. The prohibition wasn't about ignorance, it was about decorum. The information could exist, could circulate freely through the neighbourhood in other contexts, but the dinner table was not the venue. Bringing it to the table was like bringing the kitchen into the dining room. It violated the separation that made the whole performance function. Others were wrong in the specific, a comment that landed differently than intended because of something the speaker didn't know, a joke about a difficult marriage delivered to someone who was quietly managing a difficult marriage. a remark about someone's weight to someone who had just received a piece of medical news about their weight. These were the moments that required the most rapid and skillful intervention, because unlike the money comment, which was simply a rule violation, these had the potential to genuinely hurt someone at the table, and the hostess was responsible for ensuring that nobody left her home having been hurt by an evening she had orchestrated. The recovery technique was an art form in itself. The skilled hostess pivoted to a new subject with such smooth confidence that the pivot itself was barely visible. She introduced it not as a rescue operation, but as a natural next thought, something she'd been meaning to mention, something that had just occurred to her. Speaking of which, has anyone seen the new exhibit at the library? Not speaking of which, since nothing about what had just happened led naturally to the library exhibit, but, delivered with enough conversational momentum it worked. The table followed. The previous moment was left behind like a coat forgotten at a restaurant. It existed somewhere, but the evening continued without it, and everyone agreed, silently and collectively, that the coat had never been there at all. Dessert at a 1960s dinner party was the moment when the entire table collectively exhaled. The most stressful courses were behind everyone. The wine had done its work, and now there was cake or pie or a chilled mousse, or something involving ladyfingers and a cream that had been whipped the previous afternoon and refrigerated under a sheet of waxed paper. Dessert was the reward for having navigated every preceding rule successfully. You took a portion, you expressed pleasure, you did not decline dessert on the grounds of a diet, because declining dessert in someone's home was a statement about their dessert that they would interpret personally, and they would be correct to do so. If you were genuinely watching your figure, you took a small portion and ate it slowly and appreciatively, which conveyed the same message without the conversational cost. Dessert in this era occupied a position of genuine cultural prestige that it has since somewhat surrendered to the more complex ambivalent relationship that subsequent decades developed with sugar. In 1963, dessert was a conclusion, a flourish, the thing that completed the meal and gave it a sense of occasion. A dinner party without dessert was a dinner which was fine but different. Dessert said, "We have reached the end, and the end is sweet, and this evening has been worth having." The hostess who produced a beautiful dessert was a hostess who understood that the last impression was as important as the first, that the final note of the evening should be something that people remembered on the drive home. The options ran a spectrum of ambition. At the simpler end, a fruit pie baked that morning, served with a scoop of vanilla ice cream that had been softening on the kitchen counter for exactly the right number of minutes. At the more elaborate end, a charlotte russe, a bombe glacée, a multi-layered tort that had required an entire afternoon and at least one moment of genuine crisis that the hostess had resolved privately and would never discuss. Between these poles lived the bundt cake, the chiffon pie, the moulded chocolate mousse, the cream puffs filled with something cold and sweet and slightly impractical to serve to 12 people at dinner table. All of them produced with varying degrees of confidence. All of them received with the same warm enthusiasm that dessert reliably generated regardless of what it actually was. The serving of dessert was slightly more relaxed than the serving of previous courses. The tension of the evening had released, the wine had softened the table's formality, and the small negotiation over portion size that would have been inappropriate during the soup course was now acceptable in a more playful register. Just a small piece was fine. A tiny sliver was fine. Oh, go on then. A proper piece, which was what everyone actually wanted to say, was also fine, and was usually said with a laugh that confirmed the evening had been a success. You'd made it to dessert. Everyone had made it to dessert. The roast had been wonderful. The conversation had flowed. Nobody had said anything that couldn't be recovered from. And now there was cake. Whatever followed was manageable. After dessert, the party migrated back to the living room, in a movement that felt organic but was quietly organised. Coffee appeared, real coffee, in a pot, poured into small cups, offered with cream and sugar in a way that suggested you might want both even if you usually had neither. Liqueurs were a possibility in more sophisticated households. A small glass of something amber and serious, served on a tray with the quiet implication that the evening had arrived at its most adult phase. The men clustered in one part of the room, the women in another, not because anyone had designated it, but because the conversational gravity of the room reorganized everyone almost unconsciously. This was simply how things ended up, the same way books ended up on shelves and shoes ended up by the door. Coffee after dinner was not the same coffee as morning coffee, even if it came from the same percolator. It was slower, smaller, held in a different kind of cup, consumed in a different kind of time. The after-dinner cup was a signal that the meal was complete, and the evening was entering its final phase, not ending, but transitioning into something more relaxed, more conversational, more genuinely social than the structured formality of the table had permitted. The table had been a performance space. The living room, revisited now after dinner with the meal behind you, and the evening properly underway, was something closer to actual company. People who had been warmed up by food and wine and several hours of each other's presence, now settling into the furniture with the comfortable ease of people who had earned the right to be comfortable. The coffee itself was served from a good pot, poured by the hostess or passed around the room in the pot itself if the gathering was informal enough. A proper coffee service, pot, creamer, sugar bowl, small cups and saucers, on a tray carried from the kitchen was the formal version, and it communicated that the evening was being seen through properly to its conclusion, that no corner was being cut, that this was a household where things were done correctly from arrival to departure. Instant coffee existed and was used in everyday life without apology, but instant coffee at a dinner party was a different matter. It said that at some point the effort had been suspended, and suspending effort before the guests had left was a form of early surrender that attentive guests noticed. The gender division of the after-dinner room was one of those customs so deeply embedded that most people participating in it in 1963 would not have described it as a custom at all. It was simply what happened. The men gathered near the window or the fireplace, continuing the dinner table conversation, or beginning a new one, speaking with the slightly amplified ease of people who'd been sitting formally for 2 hours and were now expanding back into three-dimensional space. The women gathered on the sofas, their conversation shifting register, warmer, more specific, more personal than the dinner table had permitted. Both groups were having a good time. Both groups were, in their way, enjoying the very particular pleasure of time spent with people they knew, in a setting that had been designed for exactly this purpose. Nobody questioned the arrangement. The room simply organised itself, the way rooms do, and the evening continued. Leaving a dinner party too early was rude. Leaving too late was an imposition. The window between these two social failures was approximately 45 minutes to an hour after the dessert plates had been cleared, and the correct occupant of that window was identifiable by a subtle shift in the host's body language, a slight softening of the performance, a moment when the smile became very slightly less managed. The gracious guest recognised this moment and began the leaving sequence with enough lead time to make it look spontaneous. You thanked your host specifically, for the meal, for the evening, for having you, in a way that made each piece of thanks feel genuine rather than formulaic. You collected your coat without ceremony. You said goodbye to the other guests. You did not at any point open the door and then stand in it for another 20 minutes, which was the thing that actually happened at every party. Reading the signal to leave required a social attentiveness that was considered a basic courtesy in this era and is something of a lost art now. The host's body language was your primary instrument, not rudeness, never rudeness, but a quality of presence that had shifted from active hospitality into something quieter. The replenishing of drinks slowed, the posture settled. The host began to sit rather than move around the room. These were not complaints, they were information, offered by people too polite to say it has been a wonderful evening, and we are now ready for it to conclude, so instead they communicated it through the 1,000 small signals that people who understood each other were expected to read correctly. You read them. You prepared to leave. The initiation of departure was its own choreography. You didn't simply stand and announce you were going. That was too abrupt, too logistical. You created a conversational moment that contained within it the suggestion of conclusion, a natural resting place in whatever was being discussed, and from that moment you rose, and the rising itself communicated departure without requiring a formal declaration. Your spouse, if they were anywhere in the room, read the rising and began their own parallel process of extracting themselves from their current conversation, moving toward coats and goodbyes in a synchronized drift that suggested the two of you were somehow on the same wavelength without having coordinated anything at all. Which, if you'd been married for 10 years, you had. The goodbye to the hosts was warm and specific and correctly calibrated in length. Brief enough not to restart the evening, long enough to convey genuine appreciation. You stood in the foyer, coat in hand, and you said the true things. That the food had been wonderful, that the evening had been such a pleasure, that you must do this again soon, which was genuinely meant even though the scheduling of it was indefinite and both parties understood this. You did not make plans at the door. Plans made at the door were plans made in the wrong state of mind, too warm, too late, too imprecise. Plans could be confirmed by telephone the following week. The door was for gratitude and departure in that order, and then you stepped out into the night, and the door closed behind you, and the evening was over except for the part where you talked about it in the car all the way home. The dinner party was not over when you drove home. It was over when you sent the thank you note, which had to arrive within 48 hours of the event, or it might as well not arrive at all. The note was handwritten, not a phone call, not a remark the next time you ran into the hostess at the supermarket, but a physical piece of stationery with ink on it, delivered by the postal system, addressed in your best handwriting. It referenced something specific about the evening, the meal, the flowers, a particularly enjoyable conversation. It was warm but not effusive. It was brief but not cursory. It was the final piece of evidence that you'd been correctly raised and that Diane's dinner party had been worth the 6 hours of preparation she'd put into it. And Diane kept every single one she received in a small box on the shelf above her writing desk, which tells you everything you need to know about what these evenings actually meant to the people who threw them. The thank you note in 1960s. America was not a formality in the dismissive sense of the word, not something you did because you were supposed to, a box checked on the social obligation list. It was a genuine act of closure, a final gesture in a sequence that had begun with the invitation and would not be complete until this last piece arrived. It acknowledged that something real had happened, that a person had opened their home, expended significant effort, and produced an evening worth attending, and it honoured that effort with the small reciprocal effort of sitting down with paper and pen and saying so in writing. The note said, "I was there, I was present, it mattered, and want you to know I know it mattered." The stationery itself communicated things. A woman in the 1960s who maintained a supply of proper note cards, not memo paper, not the back of an index card, not even a pretty card purchased specifically for this purpose, but actual personal stationery with her name or monogram printed at the top. This woman was demonstrating a continuity of social intention that the note card itself conveyed before the first word was read. She'd thought about this. She'd prepared for this. She was the kind of person for whom thank you notes were a standing feature of life, rather than an occasional scramble. This was considered a quality of character, not merely of organisation, and it was recognised as such by the people who received the notes, and by the people who knew her well enough to know she always sent them. The writing of the note required a few specific elements assembled in the right order. You opened with gratitude, direct and warm, not buried under preamble. You referenced something specific, the crown roast, the centerpiece, the story that had made everyone laugh during the main course. The specific reference demonstrated that you had been genuinely present and paying attention, that the evening had landed, that your enjoyment had been real rather than performed. You closed with something forward-looking, how much you'd enjoyed seeing everyone, how much you hoped to do it again. That left the relationship in a state of pleasant anticipation rather than mere conclusion, and then you signed it with your first name, because this was correspondence between people who knew each other, and sincerely Margaret Foster at the bottom of a note to someone who just fed you dinner was a coldness that the warmth of the evening didn't deserve. And Diane, when the note arrived, read it at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. She read it carefully, the way people read things that are meant to be read carefully, and she put it in the box. And the box sat on the shelf above the writing desk where she composed her own thank you notes, and her seating charts, and her grocery lists for future dinner parties, already forming in the back of her mind. The evening had been a success. The note confirmed it. And somewhere across the neighbourhood the next invitation was already being considered, the next menu was being planned, and the whole beautiful, exhausting, ridiculous, deeply human enterprise was preparing to begin again. Every dinner party social circle had one. You knew exactly who they were before you even finished reading the guest list. They arrived 12 minutes early, brought wine that was either embarrassingly cheap or aggressively expensive, complemented the centerpiece by moving it slightly to see it better, and spent the cocktail hour telling a single story to every person in the room individually, as if delivering a series of private performances to a rotating audience of one. They were too loud. At the table, too opinionated about the gravy, and at some point during the main course said something about money so specific and unreserved that the table fell into the particular silence of people collectively deciding not to have heard it. And yet, there they were, at every party, invited again, because the truth that no etiquette manual would ever admit was that the rules existed to create the conditions for a good evening, and some people created a good evening by breaking every single one of them. The rule breaker was rarely malicious. That was the crucial distinction, and the one that everyone understood implicitly, even while discussing the behaviour afterward in tones of performative exasperation. Genuine rudeness, the cutting remark, the deliberate slight, the comment designed to wound rather than to simply land without adequate aim, that was unforgivable and produced a very different kind of social consequence. But the enthusiastic rule breaker, the one who violated the dress code because they'd gotten distracted, who said the wrong thing about money because they simply didn't have the same internal editor that everyone else had installed, who stayed 40 minutes too long because they were genuinely having the best time and couldn't tell the difference between their best time and their host's exhaustion. This person was complicated. This person was, in the right mood, the best thing at the party. They were the one who said the thing everyone had been thinking but had correctly identified as unsayable. They were the one who laughed loudest and earliest, which gave everyone else permission to laugh, and sometimes that permission was the thing the evening had needed for the previous 2 hours. They introduced topics that the approved list would never have permitted, and somehow, through sheer conversational momentum, carried the table somewhere genuinely interesting before anyone had noticed the departure from safe harbour. They told the story about the embarrassing thing that had happened to them without the self-protective editing that most people applied to self-revelation. And the story was funny in the way that unedited true stories about human embarrassment always are. The etiquette of managing a rule breaker at your own table was its own advanced course. You couldn't scold them, not during the party, not in front of the other guests, not in any way that disrupted the evening you were responsible for producing. You redirected, you absorbed. You caught your husband's eye across the centerpiece and communicated volumes in a single glance that confirmed you had both registered the comment about the Henderson's fence and would be discussing it extensively later. You laughed at the right moments to signal to the rest of the table that this was permissible, that the rulebreaker was known, understood, and vouched for, and that the evening was continuing on your terms even while they were technically dismantling them. And the next time you sat down to plan a dinner party, you put them on the list. Because a table of 12 people all behaving perfectly was a pleasant evening. But a table of 11 people behaving perfectly, and one person who had not received or had not retained the memo, that was a story. That was the thing people talked about on the drive home. That was against all the odds and against every piece of advice in every etiquette manual ever printed. What made the evening memorable? The rules existed. They mattered. And the person who broke them just enough in the right spirit was the one who proved it. Before a single guest arrived, the host had already made a decision that would shape the entire emotional texture of the evening without anyone consciously registering it. The hi-fi was on. Something was playing. And what was playing communicated, in the most subliminal possible way, the kind of evening this was going to be. The tempo, the warmth, the social register, the implicit suggestion of how formal or informal, how lively or contemplative, how contemporary or classical this household understood itself to be. Music at a 1960s dinner party was never merely background. It was the atmosphere before the atmosphere, the first impression that arrived before anyone did, the host's statement of intention delivered through a speaker cabinet positioned in the corner of the living room, with the volume set precisely low enough to talk over, but high enough to fill the silences. The choice of what to play was considered carefully by anyone who cared about these things, and in 1960s suburban America a remarkable number of people cared about these things. Jazz was sophisticated and increasingly mainstream. Dave Brubeck's Time Out had crossed over in 1959 into living rooms that had never previously owned a jazz record, and by the early 60s a certain kind of suburban home considered jazz the natural music of the well-appointed cocktail hour. It moved at the right pace. It was interesting enough to demonstrate taste without demanding attention. It said, "This is a home where things are enjoyed with some degree of cultural awareness, where a record collection is not simply functional, but reflects something real about the people who assembled it." Classical music, played at low volume during dinner, suggested a different kind of household, one with a slightly more formal self-image, more European in its reference points, more invested in the aesthetic of the dinner party as a civilized institution with deep historical roots. Brahms during the soup course was a commitment. It was not wrong. It was, in its way, very correct. But it established a specific tone that the guests were then expected to inhabit for the evening. And if the guests were the kind of people who had come for a good time rather than a cultural experience, the mismatch between the Brahms and their actual mood produced a subtle, pleasant friction that the cocktails usually resolved within the first half hour. Popular music was more complicated. The early 1960s produced some of the most elegant popular music in American history. Sinatra's Capitol recordings, the cool sophistication of Nat King Cole, the warm precision of Tony Bennett, and these were entirely appropriate for a dinner party setting, carrying the cocktail hour with an ease and a recognizable pleasure that classical and jazz sometimes required too much effort to appreciate. What you did not play at a dinner party in 1963 was anything that had appeared recently on the charts, with the specific energy of young people. Not yet, not here, not at this table. That music was for a different occasion and a different decade that was already gathering at the edges of this one, not quite arrived. The volume was the final calibration. Too loud, and conversation competed with music, and conversation always lost, and what you had was not a dinner party but a performance, too quiet and the music failed its purpose entirely, vanished into the walls, left the room without atmosphere, exposed every silence at the table to its full awkward weight. The right volume was felt rather than calculated, present, warm, undemanding. A current of sound running underneath the evening like a river underneath ice, there, always, supporting everything above it, never breaking through. Strip away the silverware rules and the seating charts and the thank you notes and the jello mould, and what you're left with is something surprisingly simple and surprisingly human. The 1960s suburban dinner party was, at its most fundamental level, an act of community maintenance. It was the technology that a particular society in a particular moment had developed for keeping people connected to each other, for creating and reinforcing the bonds that made a neighborhood into something more than a collection of houses, that made acquaintances into friends, that made the street you lived on into a place where someone might notice if your lights didn't come on in the morning. All of it, the correct fork, the arrival window, the thank you note, was in service of this. The rules were the scaffolding, the connection was the building. The suburb itself was new enough in the 1950s and 60s that its social architecture was still being invented in real time. People had arrived from different places, from cities, from small towns, from the disruption of the war and the migration of the post-war economy, and they had landed in these new neighborhoods without the inherited social fabric that older communities took for granted. The dinner party was one of the primary tools they used to build that fabric from scratch. You invited people into your home. You showed them who you were through the choices you made, the food, the table, the music, the conversation you cultivated and the conversation you redirected, and they showed you the same, and gradually over many evenings, many meals, many navigations of the compliment circuit and the seating chart and the correct handling of a bread knife, you built something. You built people who knew each other. The rules mattered because they created a shared language. When everyone at the table was operating within the same framework of expectations, the friction of misunderstanding was reduced, and the energy that would otherwise go into social navigation could go instead into genuine engagement. The etiquette was a kind of agreed-upon grammar, not the content of the communication, but the structure that made communication possible. And like any grammar, it was most visible when it was violated, most useful when it was invisible, and most powerful when it was simply assumed by everyone present as the natural way that things were done. What the dinner party also provided, and what nobody in 1963 would have had the vocabulary to describe in quite these terms, was a container for something that modern life has made increasingly rare. Extended, undivided, in-person attention given to a specific group of people over a specific span of time. 4 hours at a table and in a living room, with no other claim on your presence, no screen to glance at, no notification to interrupt the thread of what was being said. Just 12 people and the food between them and the evening around them, working at the particular human project of being interesting to each other and making each other feel welcome and seen. It was imperfect. It was rule-bound in ways that now seem unnecessary and in some cases actively unjust. It excluded, and it conformed, and it enforced a social order that deserved the scrutiny it was about to receive in the decade ahead. And yet, there was something in those rooms, on those evenings, with the candles and the roast and the carefully chosen music and the thank you notes that arrived Tuesday morning. There was something real happening, something worth the effort. Something that Diane, sorting through the small box above her writing desk 40 years later, would recognize immediately in the handwriting on each folded card. People had come, they had sat together, they had tried, within the considerable constraints of their time, to be good to each other, and that underneath everything else was what the dinner party was always about. And so the evening ends. The last guest has stepped out into the cool night air. The door is closed softly behind them, and the house settles back into its own quiet. The candles are burning low in their holders, leaving small pools of wax on the good linen. The wine glasses are gathered on the kitchen counter. The centerpiece, so carefully assembled 2 days ago, droops very slightly in the way that flowers do when the evening they were meant for is finally, completely over. And somewhere in the dining room one dinner roll sits forgotten in the bread basket. The last one, the one. Nobody took because nobody wanted to be the person who took the last one. Small, perfect, untouched. A monument to the particular courtesy of people trying very hard to be good to each other. What strikes you, looking back at those rooms and those evenings, is not how rigid the rules were. It's how much the rules were trying to protect. They were protecting the hostess who'd been cooking since morning and deserved to have her effort honoured. They were protecting the guest who needed to know what was expected so they could relax inside those expectations. They were protecting the conversation, keeping it warm enough to be genuine, cool enough not to burn. They were protecting the evening itself, this fragile constructed thing that 12 people had agreed to show up for and participate in, and take seriously enough to dress for, to arrive at correctly, to send a note about afterward. The rules were love in a very particular and very formal disguise. The women who built these evenings, who planned the menus and polished the silver and arranged the flowers and managed the seating and redirected the conversation, and made it all look effortless while being anything but, these women were doing something real, something skilled and undervalued and now largely gone. They were architects of human connection, working in a medium that left no lasting monument, that dissolved completely at the end of every evening and had to be rebuilt from scratch for the next one. They did this without credit, without acknowledgement, without even the language to describe what they were doing as the sophisticated social labour that it was. They just did it. Because it needed doing. Because community needed tending. Because a neighbourhood was only as warm as the homes that opened their doors, and the guests who learned which fork to use, who timed their arrivals to the minute, who wrote their thank you notes on Tuesday morning with their best pen. They were doing something real too. They were honouring the effort. They were saying through every small correct gesture that this mattered. That an evening spent with people you knew, around a table someone had set with care, eating food someone had worried about since Monday, that this was worth showing up for properly. Worth the dress and the wine selection and the bread buttering technique and the left-right conversational rotation and all the rest of it. Worth the whole beautiful, exhausting, slightly absurd apparatus. So tonight, as you settle deeper into wherever you've been listening to this, maybe in a bed considerably more comfortable than anything a 1960s housewife spent an afternoon worrying about, take a quiet moment for the people in those rooms, for Diane and Barbara and Gerald and the man with the highway opinions and the couple new to the neighbourhood, and the child on the third stair listening to the voices drift up from below. They were doing what people have always done, in every era and every culture and every configuration of table and chair and shared meal that history has produced. They were reaching toward each other. They were saying, in the only language their particular moment gave them, "I see you. Come in, sit down. We made something for you." The candles have burned out now. The last glass has been washed and dried and returned to the cabinet. The thank you note is already written in someone's mind, waiting for morning and a good pen. And the dinner party, ridiculous, rule-bound, deeply human, completely irreplaceable, is over. Sleep well.